I used to love corporate celebrations. The polished glass walls, the hum of ambition, the sense that the world was humming beneath my feet. But that night, the atmosphere felt unusually sharp, like the edges of every sound were cutting into me. I remember standing near the bar, watching reflections ripple across the champagne in my glass, telling myself to breathe, to enjoy the moment I had supposedly earned. The merger was historic. My security architecture had made it possible, and Reese had made me believe we were a team, that we were building something together, that I mattered. He had stepped away for a phone call, leaving a sleek, almost aggressively expensive phone on the polished bar counter. I didn't intend to look at the screen when it vibrated. It simply slipped into my view like a snake uncoiling. A notification banner. One letter for the name.
D.
I knew exactly who that was. Dahlia. The investor Reese spoke about with a subtle reverence, the kind a person uses for someone powerful enough to alter their fate. I didn't expect the text to slice straight through my chest. Finalize the transfer, darling. And the vulnerability is still open, just as you promised. Celebrate later, away from her. For a moment, everything slowed. The music blurred. The chatter thinned out. My own heartbeat became the loudest thing in the room. It felt surreal that words so short could dismantle years of belief, affection, and trust. The transfer, which I thought was delayed. The vulnerability, the one I'd been fighting to close. And her, Dahlia, not me, in the intimate shadow of the message. The realization collapsed inside me with brutal clarity. They were using my work, my trust, and my access. Not for growth, not for innovation, but for personal profit. And behind my back, laughing at how willingly I handed them everything they needed. Then Reese appeared behind me, his presence cold in a way I'd never noticed before. "You shouldn't have given me the code, Vera," he said. No apology. No explanation. Just annoyance that I had seen what I wasn't supposed to. He snatched his phone from my hand. Dahlia understood the necessity of absolute control. Your idealism about open source was always inefficient. It was strange. I didn't feel myself collapse. I didn't even feel anger yet. I felt detached, like I was watching the scene from across the room. The version of me standing there, holding a glass she didn't remember picking up, didn't feel real anymore. I had spent years closing vulnerabilities in systems, building walls, patching flaws, believing that security was an act of protection. I had never considered that the person closest to me saw vulnerabilities as tools to exploit, including mine. Everything after that was a blur. I remember cold air hitting my face as I stepped outside. I remember the distant city, lights blurring into streaks. I remember trying to breathe and realizing I couldn't. And then nothing. Darkness. Silence. A system crash. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in a hospital. I wasn't anywhere that made sense. I was slumped over a keyboard in a cramped, fluorescent-lit university computer lab, surrounded by old textbooks covered in my own handwriting. My handwriting from years ago. I lifted my head and the world tilted, but the date on the dusty wall clock was steady, mercilessly clear. April 20th, 2014. 9 years before everything fell apart. 9 years before the betrayal. 9 years before Reese. I wasn't dead. I wasn't alive in the same way either. I was reset. Given a new boot sequence. A clean slate, whether I deserved it or not. And the first person I thought of wasn't Reese or Dahlia. It was Owen, my younger brother's best friend, the brilliant, ethical hacker Reese would one day try to recruit and throw aside. The one person who had never treated vulnerability as a weakness. If I was going to rebuild, to protect myself, to stop the collapse that had once swallowed me whole, I needed to find him. Time travel, or whatever this was, didn't feel dramatic. No lightning, no cinematic flash, no overwhelming sense of destiny. It felt quiet, almost eerily gentle, like sinking slowly into water. The computer lab smelled faintly of dust and lukewarm coffee. My old worn-out backpack lay by my feet, the same one I had thrown away years ago. My phone was the same cracked model I carried during university, buzzing with notifications from group chats I hadn't thought about in so long. It was all too real. I took slow breaths, letting the weight of this impossible second chance settle inside me. If I was here in my 20-year-old body at this exact point in time, then the sequence of events leading to Reese's rise and my downfall hadn't begun yet. I could stop it, but I couldn't do it alone. I needed someone who understood systems not just as structures, but as ecosystems of trust. Someone who believed in integrity more than ambition. Someone whose moral compass didn't falter, even under pressure. Someone like Owen. The memories of him resurfaced with surprising warmth. He'd been my younger brother's best friend, the quiet, thoughtful kid who always seemed slightly out of place in loud rooms. He had an affinity for code the same way musicians have an instinct for rhythm. Even back then, he saw patterns I didn't, and I was supposed to be the prodigy. I found him exactly where I hoped he would be, hosting an informal workshop in one of the smaller tech classrooms, guiding a handful of students through basic security concepts. I watched him from the doorway for a moment, unnoticed, absorbing the version of him I had somehow forgotten. He wasn't flashy or overly confident. His voice was calm, patient, warm, a tone that eased anxiety instead of sharpening it. He corrected mistakes gently, explained concepts without condescension, and stayed fully present with people who were still learning to crawl in a world where he could already run. The contrast between him and Reese, who weaponized knowledge, was almost painful. When the group dispersed, I approached him. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a soft sheen on the scattered keyboards and sticky note-covered monitors. He recognized me immediately, offering a small smile, the same kind of smile I had once taken for granted. "Vera, didn't expect to see you here," he said. I swallowed. My palms were unexpectedly damp. This was supposed to be simple, a straightforward conversation. But the weight of what I knew, of what would someday unfold if I did nothing, made my voice feel tight. "I need your help," I said. Not dramatic, not emotional, just honest. Concern flickered across his face instantly. Owen had always been perceptive, especially when it came to shifts in someone's tone. He leaned slightly forward, not intrusively, but with quiet attention. "What's wrong?" There were 1,000 ways I could have approached the truth, but none of them mattered now. I had to give him something real, something that would justify the urgency I felt pulsing beneath my ribs. "There's a vulnerability in a software suite that's about to go into early deployment," I said. "A serious one. I know the exact location of the backdoor, and I know it'll be exploited." He frowned. "That vulnerability is classified." "How do you know this?" I hesitated. The truth, that I had lived through the consequences, hovered at the edge of my thoughts. But I couldn't reveal everything. Not yet. Not without proof. Not without risking sounding unhinged. So I offered him the only truth I could safely share. Because I know the cost of the breach. I know what people will do if it stays open. I paused, trying to steady my voice. And I want the code to be clean. The room felt smaller somehow, the lights too bright. Owen studied me with quiet intensity, not suspicious, but deeply trying to understand. "You're serious," he murmured finally. "This isn't a hypothetical." "No," I whispered. "It isn't." Something shifted in his expression, something subtle, but unmistakably protective. He didn't question my motives. He didn't accuse me of exaggerating. He simply accepted the weight in my voice. "All right," he said softly. "Show me everything you know." Relief washed through me so abruptly, it almost felt like dizziness. I hadn't realized how tense my shoulders were until they eased. With Owen beside me, analyzing the vulnerability with a calm precision that steadied my own heartbeat, the path ahead didn't feel as terrifying. For the first time since waking up in this past version of my life, I wasn't alone. Owen didn't know the future. He didn't know Reese or Dahlia or the betrayal waiting years ahead. But he knew how to defend a system. And without realizing it, he was already defending me. Working with Owen again felt strangely natural, even though this version of him had no idea how intertwined our futures were supposed to become. The old computer lab we chose as our base was small, crowded with outdated towers and tangled cords, but it offered privacy. the kind of space where quiet focus could grow into something steadier. We sat across from each other, screens glowing a soft blue in the dim room, while the hum of the machines created a steady backdrop. I watched him as he typed, noticing details I never cared to observe the first time around. The way his brow furrowed slightly when he concentrated, the disciplined rhythm of his keystrokes, the calm exhale he released each time he identified a potential exploit. He worked like someone who respected the system he was protecting. I had spent years after this point surrounded by people who viewed systems as opportunities to manipulate. People like Reese. People like Dahlia. Ambition had ruled that world, corrosive and sharp. But here, sitting beside someone who believed in ethics over ego, I felt something loosen in my chest. A kind of safety. Not the fragile illusion I once mistook for love, but the real kind. The safety that comes from someone who treats vulnerability as something to protect, not exploit. Owen leaned back in his chair, stretching, his eyes scanning the code on his screen. "You weren't exaggerating," he said quietly. "This flaw is serious. If someone wanted to reroute financial transfers or hide internal transactions, this would be the exact place to do it." "I know," I murmured. He didn't ask how. He didn't press. Maybe he sensed that the answer was too heavy to unpack. Or maybe he trusted my reasons more than he trusted the logic behind them. Either way, he kept working. We developed a rhythm. I identified the structural weaknesses, the sequences that Reese and Dahlia would one day manipulate. Owen countered them with defensive frameworks, patching and strengthening until the code was clean, stable, resilient. It was like building a fortress brick by brick, the two of us reinforcing each other's blind spots. Late nights blurred into each other. Sometimes we spoke, but more often, the silence felt comfortable. The kind of silence that fills the air between people who don't need to perform for each other. One night, after hours of scrutinizing an especially stubborn exploit path, I let my head rest briefly on my crossed arms. The faint ache behind my eyes pulsed with fatigue, and with the weight of the future I was desperately trying to rewrite. "Hey," Owen said softly, not startled, not judgmental. "You should take a break." "I'm fine," I mumbled into my sleeve. "You're exhausted." His tone wasn't scolding, but grounded. Warm. "Let me keep going a bit." It struck me how easily he offered help, without wanting anything in return. No superiority. No hidden agendas. Just simple, steady sincerity. I lifted my head slightly, watching him. "Why are you helping me this much?" He paused, fingers hovering over the keys. His expression was thoughtful, not confused. "Because you asked," he said. "Because you sounded like you were carrying something heavy. And because I trust you know what you're doing, even if you can't tell me everything." Trust. Such a small word. Such a rare one in the world I had come from. I looked at him, the glow from the monitor highlighting the quiet sincerity in his features, and felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through me. Not romantic, not dramatic, not overwhelming. Just steady. A quiet certainty that if I fell, he would try to catch me, not because he wanted to gain something, but because that was who he was. Working with him felt like reinforcement, not just in code, but in myself. As the days passed, we formed a silent alliance. I fed him strategic insights on early-stage attacks Reese and Dahlia were beginning to test, patterns I remembered clearly, steps I had once ignored. Owen responded with defenses that were elegant in their simplicity, airtight in their execution. Each time we blocked an exploit before it could be discovered, a small, private triumph settled inside me. I wasn't powerless anymore. I wasn't naive. I was prepared, and with Owen's quiet steadiness beside me, the fear that once controlled me began to fade. One dawn, after hours of wrestling with a particularly aggressive intrusion attempt, the system finally stabilized. The logs showed the attack had failed before even touching the core. A wave of relief washed over me, so strong it almost left me breathless. Owen leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "We did it," he said with a tired smile. I nodded, feeling something inside me settle. Something like safety. Something like the earliest roots of trust, not dramatic, not sudden, but real. For the first time in this second life, I felt like I wasn't just surviving. I was rebuilding. The first week of working with Owen settled into a rhythm that felt strangely grounding. Not easy. Nothing about rewriting the future should have been easy, but steady, like walking across stones in a river, without slipping. Each day had its own challenge, its own tiny victory, and its own quiet reassurance. We had turned the dusty computer lab into a kind of command center. Although the room was a mess of tangled cables and flickering monitors, it began to feel familiar. Safe. The hum of machines, the glow of screens, the soft clicking of keyboards, these became the soundtrack of my second life. Owen showed up earlier each day, often with something small but thoughtful. A spare pair of headphones because mine had a frayed wire, a thermos of tea when he noticed I skipped breakfast, sticky notes with reminders written in neat handwriting. Little things. Things Reese would have never noticed, let alone done. The irony stung at first. Then it softened into something else. I kept waiting for Owen to demand explanations, but he never did. Instead, he operated on simple, steady trust. The way he worked beside me made it impossible to feel judged. There was an effortless honesty in him, the kind that didn't need dramatic declarations or probing questions. The contrast between my past and this present version of him was overwhelming at times. One afternoon, after hours of testing defenses against a vulnerability I knew Dahlia would target later in the year, I stepped outside to breathe. The late spring air was warm, drifting gently across my skin. For a moment, I closed my eyes and listened to the distant sounds of campus, laughter, footsteps, the rhythmic thump of a basketball somewhere far away. I felt like a ghost drifting through a life I had already lived, but wasn't entirely a part of anymore. Owen appeared a few minutes later, hands in his pockets. He didn't intrude or hover. He simply stood beside me, looking out at the soft evening light. "You okay?" he asked. It was such a simple question, but it carried weight. The type of weight that said he cared about the answer, not the surface-level one, but the real one. "I'm trying to be," I said honestly. "Trying is enough," he replied, voice gentle. That was another difference between him and the people I'd once surrounded myself with. He didn't push for strength, perfection, or performance. He simply accepted effort as valid. We returned to the lab, settling back into our roles. I monitored for the early signs of an infiltration sequence I remembered vividly, Dahlia's testing, before she would hand over the exploit to Reese. Back then, I had brushed it off as a system glitch. Now I knew better. Working beside Owen allowed me to see the past from a different angle. The blind spots I had once dismissed were glaring under this new light. And Owen's presence made it easier to face each memory without spiraling. He leaned over my shoulder at one point, examining a suspicious log entry. I felt a strange wave of comfort being near someone who didn't see proximity as power or control. With Reese, closeness had always been calculated. With Owen, closeness was simply natural, quiet, human. "Someone's probing the authorization layers," he murmured. "Do you recognize the pattern?" I did. "The early Dahlia fingerprint." I nodded. "Yes. And it's going to escalate if we don't strengthen that section." Owen didn't question how I knew. He just moved forward with me, building the patch. Not as a superior or a savior, but as an equal. Someone who stood beside me, not above me. The more time we spent together, the more that quiet alliance grew into something stronger. Not romantic, not overwhelming, but a deep sense of being understood. It was subtle and slow, like a coded handshake being exchanged one line at a time. By the end of the week, our patch defenses were airtight, and the early intrusion attempts had been blocked so cleanly that the perpetrators would assume the system wasn't worth touching yet. A temporary victory, but in this timeline, temporary could save everything. When we finally shut down for the night, Owen gathered his things slowly. He hesitated at the door, looking back at me with a thoughtful expression. "Vera," he said gently, "whatever you're trying to fix, you don't have to do it alone." The words hit deeper than he realized. In my first life, no one had ever said that to me. Not in a way that felt real. I watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him, and felt a quiet certainty settle inside me. This wasn't just a second chance at stopping Reese. It was a second chance at choosing who stood beside me. And this time, I wasn't choosing wrong. The first hint that the timeline was beginning to shift came quietly, not with alarms or dramatic messages, but with a single data blip that shouldn't have existed yet. It appeared on my screen late in the evening when Owen had stepped out to refill his water bottle. A clean, precise ping. Too clean. Too precise. It was a fingerprint I knew intimately, though it shouldn't have shown up for months. Dahlia. She was early. The realization sent a shiver through me, not of fear, but of awareness. The timeline wasn't following the script perfectly. Our actions, mine and Owen's, were rippling outward, nudging events into new paths. Some shifts were small, subtle, but some were immediate, like this one. I leaned in, studying the signature in the logs. She wasn't attacking. Not yet. Just probing. Testing the waters. And for the first time, I felt something like power rising inside me, the ability to intercept her before she became the threat she once was. When Owen returned, he noticed the change in my expression instantly. What happened? She made her first move earlier than expected. He didn't question who she was. He had stopped asking a long time ago. Instead, he took the chair beside me, eyes scanning the logs with calm focus. Then we stay ahead of her, he said. His certainty steadied me. We worked through the evening, reinforcing the layers Dahlia was sniffing at. It wasn't a dramatic battle. It was quiet, strategic. A tightening of screws, a locking of gates. And yet, I could feel my heartbeat quicken every time her signature reappeared in the logs, tiny pings like echoes of my past. I remembered how she once looked at me during the merger celebration. Cool. Confident. Almost bored. As if she already owned the outcome, already owned Reese. She had been the one whispering ambition into his ear, nudging him toward exploitation, manipulation, betrayal. This time, she would find the doors locked long before she reached them. As we worked, Owen's shoulder brushed mine lightly. No intention, just proximity in a shared focus. The contact grounded me, anchoring me in the present. I wasn't trapped in memories. I wasn't reliving the downfall. I was rewriting it. Hours later, when the system stabilized again and Dahlia's probes faded into silence, I leaned back and let out a slow, controlled breath. Owen glanced at me with that steady, quiet concern he never voiced too loudly. Are you okay? Yes, I said softly. For the first time, I think I actually am. He held my gaze a moment longer, as if weighing the truth of it, then nodded. We cleaned up the last logs, shut down the system, and walked out of the building together. The night air was cool, brushing against my skin like a reminder that this timeline was still malleable, still changeable. No longer a story written in betrayal. A story I had the power to revise. And with Owen beside me, the rewrite didn't feel impossible. It felt inevitable. Even in this altered timeline, the shadows of my past kept reaching for me. Sometimes a small detail, a phrase Reese once said, a pattern in the code I had long memorized, would surface unexpectedly, like a ghost whispering through the wires. It reminded me that even with a second chance, some consequences could linger if I wasn't vigilant. That night, I stayed late in the lab alone. Owen had left for the evening, but the glow of the monitors and the hum of cooling fans kept the space alive. I traced a vulnerability in a backup system, one I remembered from the original timeline, a vulnerability that had allowed Dahlia to maneuver Reese's financial moves without anyone noticing. If I patched it now, I could prevent the cascade that had led to the betrayal. As my fingers hovered over the keyboard, I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once defined me in high-stakes moments. But it was different this time, steadier, clearer. I wasn't reacting blindly. I wasn't being manipulated by someone else's ambition. I was in control. The logs flickered. A subtle anomaly. Not an attack, but a probe. I recognized it immediately, Reese testing, evaluating, as he always had. In the original timeline, I had been caught off guard. Now, I could anticipate it. I leaned back, considering the layers of trust, ambition, and greed that had shaped the corporate world I had once known. Everyone had a role, some players predictable, others mercurial. But the difference now was that I had an ally who didn't exploit weakness but protected it. Owen's presence in my life had changed the game entirely. I ran simulations, testing every possible exploit that could follow the probe. Each failed attempt confirmed the security measures we had put in place. For the first time, I felt a measure of certainty that the breaches, the manipulations, the betrayals that had once crushed me could be stopped before they even began. And then I paused, realizing something profound. Even in this early stage, I could see the threads of the future forming differently. Actions I took now wouldn't just prevent a breach. They would influence decisions, partnerships, and ambitions. The echo of the future was alive in the present, and I was listening. The thought was dizzying. The past I had known, the pain, the betrayal, the loss, was real, but it no longer had power over me. I had been given a rare gift, foresight, paired with the ability to act. And more importantly, I wasn't alone. Owen's trust, calm presence, and unwavering dedication had created a buffer between the chaos I remembered and the control I now possessed. I finally shut down the system, stretching my tired muscles. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the servers cooling down. Outside, the city carried on as if nothing had changed, but I knew better. Everything had shifted. Every decision, every patch, every alert was an echo of what might become. I left the lab that night with a sense of clarity I had never known. The betrayal that had once defined my life was no longer inevitable. I could anticipate the dangers, defend against them, and build a foundation where trust, genuine, ethical trust, could grow. With Owen beside me, I felt capable of more than just survival. I felt capable of rewriting the story entirely. For the first time in years, I slept without a shadow hanging over me. The echoes of the future weren't frightening anymore. They were a map, one that I had the power to follow. The days that followed became a study in precision. Every line of code, every system protocol, every patch I implemented felt like a stitch in a larger fabric, one I was carefully weaving to prevent the unraveling I had once endured. The corporate world still hummed outside the university walls, oblivious to the quiet war being fought in a small lab, but I no longer felt powerless in its shadow. Owen was my constant anchor. Even when he wasn't at my side, I could imagine his calm, deliberate presence guiding my choices, reminding me to check and double-check, to anticipate and adapt. He had an almost uncanny ability to see where I might falter, to recognize the flaws I couldn't yet perceive. Together, we weren't just reacting to threats. We were rewriting the architecture of possibility. That afternoon, I stared at a particularly complex sequence of data streams. It was the sort of exploit that had once gone unnoticed until it was too late, a subtle loophole that Dahlia had manipulated to her advantage. I traced the path carefully, mapping the chain of events, the potential for misuse. Then I began coding a new solution, something elegant, resilient, and almost invisible in its efficiency. Owen leaned over my shoulder, his expression calm but attentive. "You've thought of everything," he said quietly. "I don't see a way through." I shook my head, though a small surge of pride lifted me. "That's the point. There shouldn't be a way through." He smiled faintly. It wasn't the kind of smile that demanded emotion or that carried any weight of expectation. It was the kind of acknowledgement that said, "I see you. I understand. You're not alone." For hours we worked, refining the code, testing scenarios, simulating intrusions. Each iteration brought more certainty. Every potential loophole that had once been exploited was now fortified. The new code wasn't just a defense mechanism, it was a promise. A promise that the mistakes of the past wouldn't repeat themselves. That the systems I had trusted and the people I had once relied on could now be held accountable to a higher standard. By evening, the lab had grown quiet. The monitors reflected our tired faces, but the sense of achievement was undeniable. I leaned back, fingers brushing over the keyboard one last time before powering down. In this silence, I could feel the weight of what we had accomplished, a security that wasn't just technical, but ethical. "Tomorrow," Owen said softly, "we keep building. This is only the beginning." I nodded. He was right. Each step, each patch, each preventive measure was a brick in the foundation of a life I could finally control. The new code wasn't just about protecting systems. It was about protecting myself, about protecting the possibility of trust, of stability, of safety. For the first time in what felt like years, I realized that power didn't have to be frightening. It didn't have to be about domination or control. Real power, the kind that mattered, was quiet, patient, and deliberate, and it could be shared without fear. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally ready to face whatever came next. The months that followed were a study in patience, vigilance, and trust. Each day, I returned to the lab with a growing sense of purpose, a quiet confidence that had been absent in my life before this second chance. The chaos and betrayal that had once defined my world were now just distant memories, muted by the clarity that came with foresight and preparation. I wasn't just rewriting code anymore, I was rewriting my own story. Owen and I developed a rhythm, a partnership built not on convenience, but on mutual respect and understanding. We communicated in a language of precision, logic, and silent reassurance. Sometimes words were unnecessary, a glance, a pause, or the way he adjusted a line of code beside me was enough. He had a rare ability to anticipate, to see weaknesses I hadn't yet imagined, and to guide our work with a quiet confidence that made me feel secure even in the most complex situations. The system we built together became more than just a defense. It was a fortress of trust and foresight. Every patch we implemented, every potential exploit we closed, felt like a protective shield around not just the networks and data, but around the life I was reclaiming. Each success, no matter how small, reinforced the knowledge that I was no longer vulnerable to betrayal or manipulation. I had learned the hard way that trust could be broken, but I was now learning that it could also be rebuilt, carefully, deliberately, and with people who deserved it. There were nights when I stayed late, watching the code run through its tests, feeling the familiar hum of the computers like a heartbeat that echoed my own determination. I sometimes thought about Reese and Dahlia, about the lives they would eventually lead and the power they would attempt to wield. But in this timeline, I wasn't waiting to be their victim. I was prepared. I was ahead. And I wasn't alone. The awareness of this gave me a calm resolve I had never experienced before. I remember the first day I had approached Owen, the fear and uncertainty swirling inside me as I revealed what I knew about the vulnerabilities. Back then, I had been desperate, isolated, and unsure if anyone could understand the stakes. Now, as I looked back on that moment, I realized how far we had come, not just in the strength of the systems we built, but in the quiet trust and reliability we had cultivated. Owen had become a cornerstone, a constant in the chaos, a reminder that collaboration could exist without manipulation, and that loyalty could exist without expectation. By the time the systems were fully secure, the difference was tangible. Every attempt to probe, every intrusion that might have gone unnoticed in the past, was now intercepted and nullified. I had anticipated patterns, built safeguards, and ensured that the vulnerabilities that once caused devastation were now impossible to exploit. For the first time, I felt the weight of absolute security, not just technical but emotional. I knew I could face the world without fear of betrayal because the foundation of my life was strong, carefully constructed, and protected by people who had proven their integrity. As Owen and I reviewed the final simulations, he glanced at me with a quiet acknowledgement. "It's done," he said simply. No fanfare, no dramatic gesture, just the steady, calm truth of completion. "Yes," I replied, allowing a small smile. The relief was real, but more than that, it was the satisfaction of knowing that the years of pain and loss had been transformed into something meaningful. The past could no longer define me. The mistakes, the betrayals, the vulnerabilities, they had been acknowledged, addressed, and secured. I powered down the last system for the night, feeling the weight of fatigue, but also a sense of triumph that had nothing to do with ego or recognition. It was a personal victory, a reclaiming of agency and control. For the first time, I understood the true power of foresight, preparation, and trust. As we left the lab together, The night air felt crisp and filled with possibility. I realized that the future I had once feared was no longer predetermined. I had a role in shaping it, and with Owen beside me, steady, reliable, and unwavering, I knew that whatever came next, I would face it with clarity, resilience, and confidence. The foundations were secured. Not just the systems, not just the networks, but the foundation of my life. And for the first time in years, I felt fully, undeniably, unshakably safe.